When I was a child, my mother, Emily, worked long night shifts at a local care facility and wouldn't return home until around 3 in the morning. My brothers, Noah and Ethan, and I would typically be asleep by the time she arrived. It was an unremarkable routine, at least until that one night. It began with an odd restlessness that stirred me from my sleep around 11 p.m. At first, I couldn't place what had woken me, but then it hit like a tidal wave, an unshakable dread that my mother was going to die that very night. It consumed me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I couldn't ignore it, couldn't brush it aside. My chest tightened as tears streamed down my face. I clutched my blanket and prayed, begged, pleaded with some higher power to spare her. Minutes turned to hours, and the overwhelming sense of impending doom refused to let go. My hands trembled, my heart raced, and the night dragged on in agonizing stillness. Eventually, the tears subsided. Exhaustion took hold, and I drifted off into a fitful sleep. When I woke in the morning, it was to the familiar clinking of dishes in the kitchen and the smell of coffee. Relief washed over me. Mom had come home safely. Everything seemed normal, and yet, the memory of that night lingered like a dark cloud in the back of my mind. Over breakfast, my dad, Michael, mentioned something that made my stomach churn. "Emily," he said, "I had this awful feeling last night that you were going to be in a car accident. It was so bad I almost called you." My mother paused, her face pale. "That's strange," she replied. "I had an uneasy feeling while driving home. I even took a different route than usual. Something told me I shouldn't go the way I normally do." I froze, the toast halfway to my mouth. My father's words, my mother's decision, and my own harrowing experience. All of it intertwined in an eerie synchronicity. Yet, I kept my mouth shut. I didn't tell them about my sleepless night, my prayers, or the suffocating dread that had consumed me. Some secrets, I decided, were better left unspoken. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my bones. The memory of that night clung to me like a shadow, refusing to let go. It wasn't just the fear I'd felt. It was the strange connection we, my dad, my mom, and I, seemed to share in that moment. None of us had spoken of it further, but the silence felt loaded, as if the air in our house had grown heavier somehow. Then, about a week later, something else happened. It was just after midnight, and I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I'd started leaving my door cracked open at night, a thin sliver of hallway light cutting into the darkness of my room. That's when I heard it, the faintest whisper of a voice. At first, I thought I was imagining things. It was so soft, so indistinct, that I couldn't make out the words. But then it came again, more insistent this time, and I realized it was coming from the hallway. My heart began to race as I slid out of bed and crept toward the door, the wooden floor cold beneath my bare feet. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The whispering stopped. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, my hand gripping the edge of the door. The hallway stretched out before me, empty and silent. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I turned to go back to bed, I saw it. A shadow moved at the far end of the hall, just beyond the reach of the light. It wasn't the shadow of a person. It was too tall, too thin, and it moved in a way that made my skin crawl, as if it were gliding rather than walking. I backed into my room, shutting the door quickly but quietly, and scrambled under my covers. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might wake the entire house. The whispering didn't return that night, but sleep eluded me. When morning came, I was exhausted and jumpy, every creak and groan of the house setting me on edge. At breakfast, I studied my family, wondering if anyone else had experienced something strange. My brothers were their usual selves, arguing over who got the last pancake, and my mom and dad looked tired but otherwise normal. I decided not to say anything. After all, what could I even say? That I'd heard whispers and seen a shadow that didn't belong? They'd think I was losing it. But the following night, it happened again. This time, the whispering was louder, clearer. It sounded like my name. Alex. I sat up in bed, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything but stay there. Yet I couldn't move. It was as if the sound had rooted me to the spot. Alex. The voice called again, drawn out and almost melodic, like a taunt. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I threw off the covers and darted for the door. The hallway was empty, just as it had been the night before. But this time, I wasn't alone. Noah stood at the end of the hall, his face pale and his eyes wide. "Did you hear it too?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. Together, we crept down the hallway, our footsteps muffled by the carpet. As we approached the living room, the air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on my arms standing on end. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt almost tangible. We reached the living room and found nothing out of the ordinary. The furniture was where it always was, the curtains drawn, the faint glow of the streetlights outside seeping in through the gaps. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. "Maybe it was just the wind," Noah said, though his voice lacked conviction. I nodded again, desperate to believe him, even though I knew better. Something was in our house, and whatever it wasn't going to leave us alone. The days that followed were a haze of unease and sleepless nights. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat. Noah and I didn't speak of what we'd heard again, but a silent understanding passed between us. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. One night, as the clock struck midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and coming from downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat. I strained my ears, hoping it was just my dad getting a glass of water, but the sound didn't match his usual shuffling gait. This was different, methodical, almost hungry. I slipped out of bed and opened my door just enough to peek out. Noah's door was open, and I could see him standing in the hallway, his face pale as moonlight. He'd heard it too. Without a word, we crept down the stairs together, each step feeling like a lifetime. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. The footsteps had stopped, but the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. We stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. Then, from the corner of the room, we heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. The sound vibrated through the air, sending chills down my spine. Slowly, I turned toward the source of the noise. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest, something moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its form seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a glitch in reality. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The thing didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural. As it entered the faint glow of the streetlight, I saw it more clearly. Its face was a void, a blackness that seemed to suck in the light around it. And yet, I could feel it watching me, its gaze piercing and malevolent. "Leave us alone," Noah shouted, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. The creature tilted its head, as if amused. Then, without warning, it lunged. Noah and I screamed as we stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The creature stopped just short of us, its form dissolving into a cloud of darkness that swirled around us before retreating into the shadows. For a long moment, we just lay there, too terrified to move. Finally, the silence returned, but it was no comfort. We knew it was still there, lurking, waiting. The next morning, we told our parents everything. At first, they didn't believe us. My dad insisted it was just a nightmare, and my mom tried to reassure us that the house was safe. But as we described the creature, the whispers, and the oppressive feeling that had plagued us for weeks, their expressions changed. They didn't say anything, but I could tell they were hiding something. Later that day, I overheard them talking in hushed tones. "It's happening again," my dad said. "We thought it was over when we moved." "What do we do?" my mom asked, her voice trembling. "We'll figure something out," my dad replied. "We have to." Their words sent a chill through me. What had they meant by again? Had this happened before? And why had we moved in the first place? That night, I decided I needed answers. I waited until everyone was asleep, then crept downstairs to search the old boxes my parents had stored in the basement. Most of them were filled with ordinary things: photo albums, old clothes, books. But in one box, tucked away beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers, I found a journal. It belonged to my dad. I flipped through the pages, my heart racing as I read his entries. He'd written about strange occurrences in our old house: whispers, shadows, cold spots. He described a presence that seemed to grow stronger over time, feeding on fear. My parents had tried everything to get rid of it: priests, psychics, even moving. But nothing had worked. It had followed us. As I closed the journal, the basement lights flickered. A familiar chill crept over me, and I realized I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned, and there it was. The creature stood at the foot of the stairs, its void-like face fixed on me. "Why us?" I whispered, clutching the journal to my chest. For the first time, it spoke. Its voice was a chorus of whispers, overlapping and distorted. "Because you see me. You've always seen me." Terror gripped me, but I forced myself to speak. "What do you want?" The creature didn't answer. Instead, it dissolved into darkness, leaving me alone in the flickering light. I returned to my room that night, but I knew sleep wouldn't come. The creature was right. I had always seen it, even as a child. And now I understood. It wasn't going to leave. Not ever. It was part of us, a shadow we couldn't escape. The next morning, I made a decision. I wouldn't run. I wouldn't hide. If this thing wanted to torment us, it would have to face me first. Because no matter how dark the shadow, there's always a light waiting to pierce through. And I would find it.